back, everyone. In our last lesson, we talked about some basic terminology to get started in the course. We learned about the difference between descriptive and inferential statistics. We talked about population, sample, data, variables, and sample size. And so far, we're doing a pretty good job of getting a good foundation. We need to work on some more terminology, but in this lesson, we're going to focus on the data. We need to know how to classify the data, and we need to know how to measure the data. And this is a critical step before we do any kind of analysis, because understanding the kind of data that you're working with determines the kind of graphs or methods you might use. So it's important to be able to identify that. So in the first three examples, we're going to talk about how to classify data. So looking at our definitions here, we actually have two different classifications, but one of them is broken down into two branches. We have qualitative data, which is considered categorical. So that's data that you can put into categories such as a color or a brand name or a kind of car. Then we have quantitative data. Quantitative has an N in it, and that helps me remember that that has to do with numerical values, numbers. So we have quantitative data, and that's broken down into two branches of quantitative data. We have discrete quantitative, or we have continuous quantitative. Discrete quantitative data are values that can be counted, or data that represents something, I should say, that can be counted. Like if we were looking at cars in a parking lot, then all of those cars, there might be a lot of them, but we can literally count them, how many cars there are. So discrete is countable data. Now, if we're dealing with numbers that have been measured, like a weight or a height or time or temperature, things that are measured are what's called continuous. Things that are measured, like for example, if we talk about weight, you could have 180.3 pounds, or you could have 180 pounds, or you could have 180.333 repeating pounds. Now, because the data is measured, you could have all of those decimals from 180 to 181 all in between there. And that's an infinite number of values between 180 pounds and 181 pounds. Now, if you think about all the possible integers and all the values between all those integers, it's an infinite number of values when you're talking about something that's measured. So whenever you're dealing with something that's measured, that's going to be considered quantitative continuous. So let's look at the first example. Example 1, we have identify the type of data that's being described. We have the types of cars. So for example, an SUV, a sedan, or a truck. Now those observations can be put into categories. When you ask someone what car they drive, it can go into a category. It can go into the category of a sedan, an SUV, or a truck. If it's categorical, then we would choose qualitative or categorical data. Let's look at example 2. Identify the type of data that's being described. The number of steps taken each day tracked by a pedometer. When we count our number of steps, we're literally doing just that. We're counting the steps. We could take 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, etc. We can actually count them. There might be a lot of steps. We might have our full 10,000 steps, but we can still count them even though there's a lot of them. Okay, so when we're dealing with numbers that we can count, that would be considered quantitative discrete. So for this one, we would choose option C. Let's look at example 3 now. Identify the type of data that's being described. The amount of time students spend studying per week. Now, the amount of time that students spend studying per week, whether it's in minutes or hours, that can take on an infinite number of values. You're just not talking about 1 hours or 2 hours or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. You could have 5.1 minutes, you could have 5.11 minutes, you could have 5.999 minutes, and everything in between. There's an uncountable number of decimals between every single set of consecutive integers. So you cannot count the number of minutes. Time is something that you can measure. Anything that you can measure is considered continuous. So for this example, we would choose quantitative continuous.